Let's take a look at lie number 5 about the founding of America. White settlers did not carve America out of the untamed wilderness as we got in so many movies and books of the past. The myth. The Pilgrims were the first in a parade of brave settlers who pushed civilization westward along the frontier with elbow grease and sheer grizzled old man strength. And that they were just that powerful and able to work hard and take over. And as always, it's more complicated. Truth. In written records, we come across a lot of the ideas that settlers are shocked at how easy it was, how convenient the wilderness made things for them. The East Coast is covered in forests. The eastern forests no longer existed by the time white European settlers actually showed up. The Pilgrims found that American forests just naturally were already taken down, so it's pretty easy to plant. They contained an ecological kaleidoscope of garden plots, blackberry rambles, pine barrens, and spacious groves of chestnut, hickory, and oak. Basically, that it's already cleared out and ready for farming. You don't have to pull out all these stumps, clear out the forest. It's good to go for farming. It's always a better idea to credit hard work and intelligence than to acknowledge that you just got luckier than any group of people has ever gotten in the history of the world. And so it's nice to think that these people came and they worked really hard, and they did. I'm not discounting that. But not as hard as a lot of our myths contain. And that they're not going to show up and have to chop down the forest. In many cases, natives had already done that, but were wiped out by plagues. And so they can show up and basically build their settlements on top of former villages and take over those plots of land. Example, Squanto is the big, sad, horrible example of Thanksgiving. Nobody's role in settling America has been quite as overplayed as the Pilgrims, 1620s. Despite famous sermons with titles like Into the Wilderness, the Pilgrims cherry-picked Plymouth, specifically because it was a recently abandoned town. It was a village, and so they can live there and not really have to wipe out the forest. It's already done. We're always told that the Pilgrims were helped by an Indian named Squanto who spoke English. And that's kind of this miracle they saw. Squanto was from the town that would become Plymouth. But between being born there and the Pilgrims' arrival, he had a very epic, complex, horrible journey. He was kidnapped by pirates. They were just sailing along the coast. They kidnapped from Cape Cod, which is Plymouth area, as a child, and he was sold into slavery in Spain. He learned enough English to convince someone to let him hitch a ride to the New World. After multiple years as a slave in Spain, he was able to work with some of the priests and work with the church, eventually to get back to America. But there weren't that many ships coming to America, so he had to wait quite a while to get on a ship. It's not like just getting on a plane and hopping on over. So when he finally is able to, after multiple years, he's now a teenager, kidnapped as a boy, teenager, young adult, finally able to get back to his village to see his family. And the town's gone. The plague started 1492, swept through 2 years before he comes back. Disease hits the town hard. Takes out everyone but him. He is the last of his people. And so he just starts to survive in the shell of what his town was for a little while. Then 1620, the Pilgrims show up, and he decides nobody else is using it, he might as well show them how to make his town work. And so he's got this large open area that was his village. The Pilgrims show up. They're searching for help. They don't know what they're doing. And they're largely religious settlers, but don't know much on how to build a town, how to farm. And so they fast, they pray, and stop, and they're hoping for a miracle. And that this is part of the oddity in that out pops a miracle in Squanto speaking perfect English, because he was able to understand and speak English to them. And it's very unlikely, but this is how they're able to start their town. And so it's there are multiple Thanksgivings, but this is one of the examples of Thanksgiving where it's a lot of these early contacts between natives and European settlers. So there's more than one Thanksgiving, and many different people claim Thanksgiving. Squanto is one of the more famous ones as far as that. And there's a lot more to that story, but I just want to talk a bit about this idea of just the land that was already clear. Jamestown. In 1607, 100 settlers, so this is before the Pilgrims. Pilgrims were about religion. Down south, they're more about money. And so 1607, hunter settlers found the first successful English colony. The first. We tried some earlier ones, didn't work out. So they settle an area that's very easy to defend in a large open area. The reason it's easy to defend is because the Native Americans didn't want to live there. It's built on the edge of a swamp. It's got bad water. It's got mosquitoes and bugs. It's very nasty. If you ever visit, you'll notice how gross it is. So I completely understand why the natives didn't want to live there. It's not a nice place to live on, but it's great for a fort. It's great to defend from. And so if defense was your only goal, then it's great. Terrible for farming and just living in general. Supplies from England were constantly getting lost or delayed because, well, there was an opportunity. The English hated the Spanish. The Spanish were producing a whole lot of gold out of Latin America, especially out of Mexico. And so a lot of these ship captains would go pirate, and instead of actually doing their job shipping food to Jamestown, instead they'd take the opportunity and grab some gold, and they'd go for the gold instead. And so they would have to kind of delay feeding these people, instead go for the gold. Those that were actually living in Jamestown weren't great at actually creating their own food. They were depending on those shipments. And so rich settlers would spend a lot of time looking for gold instead of actually farming and hunting. They were just waiting for the food supplies to come in that often didn't. Disease and starvation wipe out 85% of all settlers, a very high rate of those that are dying. 8,000 settlers are brought to this city, and most will die. Only 1,200 of 8,000 will survive. In many cases, they are so desperate they start to eat their pets, their rats, and even start to dig up corpses for food, as we talked about in myth number 1, and that they were eating each other, as they just weren't ready to live in this area. The John Smith-Pocahontas debate. Smith shows up and starts to change things, says, okay, people, food is not coming in, so we need to start to farm for ourselves. You can still dig for gold, but we also need to farm and feed ourselves. And so he's able to start to make certain deals. First deal is he makes peace with the local chief that was nervous about these locals moving in, grabbing up land. And so he makes a deal with the chief, and Pocahontas is one of the chief's daughters, one of actually many of the chief's daughters. He had about 100 children and multiple wives. And so Pocahontas was nothing special. She was no princess. She was one of 100 children. She was only about 13 years old. Smith would have been in his 30s at this point. This is closer of a picture in that he would have had a big bushy red beard. And so as far as a romantic relationship, that just didn't happen. What we see here is the kind of idea. This is very likely a ceremony that's common amongst a lot of the East Coast tribes, where Powhatan is showing his power. He's showing that if I wanted to, I could bash your brains in, I could kill you. And then you'd have somebody to kind of stop and intervene and stop this almost execution. And this allows him to kind of be humbled, but also afraid of Powhatan. So it's a way to show power, but unlikely Pocahontas was actually stopping anything. This is more a ceremony and a chance for him to show his power. Pocahontas definitely becomes friends with Smith and is able to bridge the cultures and start to learn the language between the two. And she's more of an intermediary, and she's working between the two cultures, but there was no romantic relationship. Eventually, Smith has an accident with gunpowder, gets hurt, is shipped back to England for medical care, and he writes a book, and he wants to make money off that book, so he really embellishes the story closer to the Disney version, where there's the possibility of romance and danger and violence and all that. Very unlikely that it happened. He's trying to sell books, and so he's going to throw in a couple lies here and there. Once Smith is kicked out, Lord Delaware, which we named Delaware after, breaks those deals and starts war. In 1614, starting a war with Powhatan, which they don't do too well on. The war ends when a new British guy comes in. By this point, Pocahontas is a little bit older, and Rolfe is still probably in his 20s. Pocahontas, well, in fact, Rolfe is likely at least 10 years older. That was just common with marriages back then. Rolfe marries Pocahontas, and this is able to kind of seal the two cultures through marriage. That stops the war. Then Rolfe is killed 8 years later, and the war starts right back up because the marriage is gone. So we get a second war. But by this point, with factors of disease and an increased amount of English people showing up, it's the last effort to remove the English because they just kept expanding, but the Powhatan lose this one as disease is a major factor and just increased numbers of English kept showing up. Major thing to bring out of this story is John Rolfe introduces tobacco. That's the big thing that really Disney's never going to talk about because, well, they probably shouldn't. They introduced tobacco to Europe. They couldn't find gold. There's no gold in Virginia. But they found something that's going to make a lot of money and is highly addicted. And so they find a cash crop that they can grow tons of. And so it requires a lot of land. And so they had to keep expanding their territory. As they expanded territory, they were expanding into Powhatan's territory. This is why these wars were happening. They're expanding the land to take over for more tobacco. This is also when we start to bring in more servants, indentured servants early on, and then the first African slaves. And their land just kept expanding and expanding, pushing further west into tribal lands to really keep producing enough tobacco to make money. But it's just not as good of a story. It's hard to turn into a religious allegory in which white people are the good guys, so pilgrims tend to be the focus for Thanksgiving. We don't talk about Smith, Pocahontas, and tobacco as the major part of founding America, but it's a huge part. Tobacco is essential to our early founding. It's just not as good of a story. And so we just don't hear about Rolfe and tobacco and Pocahontas as the major founding of America. So that's our myth as far as that one. As far as the difficulty of founding America, it's not quite so difficult. They had some help.